It's been 8 years since we've heard from Underoath, and it's really been 10 years since we've gotten an album with Aaron Gillespie, one of the original members of Underoath. But they're back with a brand new album called Erase Me. Erase Me features a change in the sense that it's less of a post-hardcore album and almost more of an industrial album. It's got very, very heavy kind of dark electronic work on songs like On My Teeth, for instance, the first single they released, and No Frame, which is almost an entirely electronic-driven song. There's not a lot of guitar riffs that really come through like they kind of had in the past. They're a little bit more subdued and kind of there as a backing. I think the electronics kind of took a front stage on this album, and it's not really necessarily that it's a detriment to the album itself. It could be if that's not something you're into. I think it kind of helps enhance it, but I think there needs to be some sort of balance there that really wasn't achieved. Now, speaking of that first track, Erase Me, one of the things I mentioned in my review is that it kind of had me worried in the sense that there wasn't enough of Aaron Gillespie's clean vocals, and it kind of worried me that this was going to be a completely Spencer-fronted band now. And that's not the case. There is actually a nice mix and a nice balance between the two vocalists. I mean, Spencer's doing a lot more of the clean vocals, not as much of the screaming, though it's still there. And Aaron's actually kind of doing some of the unclean vocals now. Not necessarily screaming, but he's got a bit more of a gruffness in his voice overall. So it's got a nice balance there. Something I was worried about that kind of, thankfully, was not anything that panned out in the actual album itself. As far as that track goes. So I'm actually happy that they managed to kind of find some sort of balance with that, because I mean, Aaron Gillespie wasn't in the last album that they released at all. Is when he went off and separated, and kind of even in Lost in the Sounds, Spencer kind of took over a lot in that album as well, but there was still that balance, which is why I think it's one of my favorite Underoath albums, probably the best Underoath album that's been released. One of the bigger changes of this album is that there's a lot more poppiness to it, and a lot more catchy melodies and hooks and harmonies and things that really weren't previously seen. I mean, there's something they kind of explored with the Changing of Times, and even with They're Only Chasing Safety, where they really kind of strayed less into the kind of more metal side of post-hardcore and kind of more into the pop-punky side of things. And while they never pushed one way or the other there, they never really pushed into it, here we kind of do get some kind of power ballads or power pop ballads, whatever you want to call them. They're definitely more subdued in terms of their energy. There's songs like I Hate It or Rapture, which is another single that they had released in anticipation of this album, as well as the song In Motion, which actually kind of sounds like, especially from Aaron Gillespie's vocal work on there, it almost sounds like it could have been on They're Only Chasing Safety, for instance. There's a little bit, probably not as heavy as something that they did on They're Only Chasing Safety, but it kind of just has that flow, that style that they kind of drew away from with their follow-up albums to that, with Define the Great Line and Lost in Sound Separation, as well as Disambiguation as well. It's something that's kind of, again, going to be hit or miss for people if it's something that you're drawn to. As an older fan, again, it's not something that we're expecting, so I don't think it's a lot of people are going to kind of get drawn to those songs or feel that those are the best of the album. However, I do think it opens up the door for new fans and for new possibilities. I think it's one thing that kind of would actually kind of draw a newer crowd that maybe was kind of put off by the aggressiveness of Underoath overall. So it's kind of a mixed bag to hear songs like that. Lyrically, a lot of them are, especially I believe I Hate It, are really personal for the band and kind of going through, talking about the things that they struggled through. So they're not, I don't want to dismiss those songs as being just fluff or anything like that, but they're just, they're kind of lacking and we know that they can put out tracks that are a little bit more aggressive, a little bit more, have a little bit more of an edge to them, but they're not necessarily bad tracks. They just don't really do anything. They're kind of just a little bit bland overall. Well, this isn't the Underoath that we're really used to. There are a couple tracks on here that I would say kind of emulates the sound of the past. In particular, again, On My Teeth, I think, is one of them that was a decent job at bridging that gap between their old sound and what they're kind of transitioning towards now, as well as this song Hold Your Breath, which really is kind of an aggressive metalcore track overall. I think they did a good job with that. There are a lot of decent songs on here that are kind of reminiscent of what we got for the past, but they're done in a way that's more simplistic and more kind of just straightforward than what we're used to, which kind of devalues those songs overall. The lyrics are a lot more straightforward, although they're definitely honest about what they were going through, what they were struggling with, the kind of identity crisis that the band suffered through previous to this album and during the writing of this album. But it's kind of lacking in style and substance in terms of the way that things are structured. And that means lyrically as well as musically as well. There's no of those kind of weird time signatures that they kind of explored, or kind of playing around with traditional song structures and progression as well. And it's kind of disappointing because they are one of the bands that managed to kind of take progressive metalcore, mathcore, and kind of make it more mainstream and kind of package it in a way that was appealing to people who may not necessarily be into bands like Botch or Converge or anything like that. They kind of had a sense of a kind of a pop sensibility to them, and not necessarily, again, that they were ever poppy or anything, but just the way they kind of presented those elements of songs. They just did it in a way that was managed to reach mainstream appeal. So it's kind of disappointing and feels like a step backwards in terms of what the band is capable and, what we've ever heard from the band in the past. It's hard to call Erase Me a bad album. I really don't think it's necessarily bad. There are some decent songs on here and songs that kind of really do are at least reminiscent of what we got from Underoath and are kind of exemplify their talent and what they can do, and particularly the closing track, I Gave Up, which kind of starts off at this slower piano ballad, but it just explodes into something that's just a culmination of all the band's individual talents, everything together, the electronics, the guitar work, the drumming, the vocal work, the dual vocal works on there, and it's just such a really powerful song and a way to close out the album, I think. But at the same time, it is something completely different that we've gotten from the band. There's a lot of tracks on here that I found myself liking, but being like, well, this doesn't sound like Underoath. This sounds like something else. And the comparison is going to be drawn to Spencer Chamberlain's band Sleepwave. I think a lot of that had an influence on this album, particularly with the industrial sound and the electronic work on here, which was something that he kind of explored with Sleepwave, as well as kind of the poppy and the ballads, things like that. And I mean, it's just the comparison definitely is apt. I mean, it really does sound like a slightly more aggressive Sleepwave, but it's not necessarily that to say that this album isn't good. It's just not what we expected, and it's not really what the band can do. We know the band can make better music than this and kind of explore and push themselves a little bit more. And I feel like a lot of that pushing went into the lyrics themselves. And kind of they just had to get it out. So it feels like this is not just an album the band wanted to make, but a kind of an album the band needed to make in order to, in a way, cleanse themselves of what they were going through and things like that. I mean, the songs themselves, even the songs that are kind of a bit underwhelming, they definitely still kind of show that the band has a mastery over the elements here of their instruments, of their own voice and everything. So it's definitely kind of a mixed bag for me, especially after this is a return, after 8 years of not really getting any new music from the band. It's a little bit disappointing. It's a little bit underwhelming. It's not bad. It's worth a listen just to hear how, the band has always been full of passion and energy, and that's definitely here on this album. It's a change sonically. It's something to get used to. I mean, there really is only one bad track on this album, and it's basically a 21 Pilots ripoff. You'll know it when you hear it, but everything else ranges from being pretty good to just bland. And that's not the worst thing that a band can do, but it's also not good to see that from a band. So I'm hoping that this is kind of a a cathartic experience for the band. They get this out and then they put out something, even if it is a change in sound, because I'm not against changing band sound, and especially after they go through something such as this band has gone through. And I think fans and people just kind of give bands too much flack for changing their sound and not being what they were and things like that. And it's just kind of I think it's disrespectful for the band, to the band itself. But that said, there are some legit criticisms here in terms of what they've done, how bland this is, how they really kind of failed to push themselves musically in any way. But at the same time, while not pushing themselves, they change in a way that feels like a regression. So I'm hoping, again, that this is just a one-off, that we hear more music from them and it doesn't necessarily have to sound like Define the Great Line or Lost in Sound Separation or They're Only Chasing Safety or anything. Even they went back to the kind of deathcore sound in their first two albums. It doesn't have to sound like anything they've done before, but we still need to hear those elements and hear the band kind of pushing themselves and maybe experimenting a little bit. So it'll be interesting to see what they go with, and what happens with this album. But overall, Erase Me, it's worth a listen. I would say it's worth a listen. I wouldn't blame anybody for not wanting to listen to it after hearing some of the singles or clips or whatever. I still think it is worth it, but go in with very low expectations. Don't expect to hear Underoath. Don't expect to hear what you loved from Underoath. It is something different, and you may not like it, but it's definitely not necessarily a bad album in any way. Overall, I would say I liked it. At least I would say I don't hate it. I'm saying I liked it probably is not the best way to put it, because I still have that mindset of this isn't Underoath, and I need to get over that. But at the same time, again, there's so many things about this that fail to capture what we know the band can do and what they're able to do. So, but just, give it a listen. Decide for yourself if this is something you want to hear from the band or not. And, like I said, either way, I'm not going to say that there's a right or wrong answer. This isn't a bad album. It's not necessarily a great album, and it's definitely not an Underoath album. Thank you so much for watching the review of Underoath's Erase Me, their first album in 8 years. How do you feel about this album? Are you comfortable with the way that they are going, with the changes that they've made? What do you think? I want to hear from you, so leave a comment down below. Make sure you like this video and subscribe to the channel for more.